5 of the Senteon and CIS webinar series, a deep dive into the CIS benchmarks for Windows workstations and servers. I'm Zach Krumkowski from Senteon, joined by my co-host Rich McGraw from the Center for Internet Security, and we are both joined by our special guest, Ray Orsini. Welcome, guys. How you doing?
Excellent.
Great. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Now, Ray, I got a couple year history with you, man. You really championed us over at Senteon, helping us with market research. And honestly, I think you might have been one of the first people to really introduce to me the MSP space. So thank you for that. Thanks for being a champion to startups entering the space. So really appreciate having you here today. But today we'll be talking about user rights assignments. And before we get into that, Ray, do you mind sharing a little bit about your background, how you got into cybersecurity, and I guess why you're so passionate about working with early stage companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is an engineer. I'm currently the CEO of OITVOIP and MSP Media Network. But my background, training, and experience is in complex and distributed networks. So I built a lot of stuff. If it crossed city, county, state, continent boundaries, I've probably built something in the space. And it works, and I've been really fortunate to work with some of the biggest names in the industry, working a lot with telcos. The downside of that is I get to see some of the inner workings and some of the not so great security postures, but it's part of life and things we're trying to correct, right? And then, I started doing traditional MSP somewhere, actually coined as MSP somewhere around 2011. And I realized it took me very few years. Awesome MSP, very successful. I did a lot of speaking stuff for ConnectWise, BrightGauge, Sonic Wall, Dell, you name it. But I realized I like working more with MSPs than I did like working with end users. And so that's where all the championing stuff came up. I'm a moderator of our MSP, the largest MSP community on the planet. And with 150 something thousand users.
That is awesome.
And I'm probably in every single, or at least most communities, any of the MSPs go in today, I'm probably in every single one of them. So
Yeah, I was excited to have Ray on today. We've been connected on LinkedIn for quite some time, but this is our first live session, so excited.
It's about time.
Relationships are made. No, that's very awesome. So before we get into user rights assignments, Rich, Ray, is there any industry trends or things going on that you've seen lately in the MSP space or greater cybersecurity space that you guys want to mention?
I mean, MFA seems to be kind of a thing. No, it's funny because we talk about some of this stuff that I don't even want to say seasoned MSPs or experienced MSPs have been doing this for a while, because there's always something that pops up, right? There's always some of the settings we'll talk about. I got my MCSE back in 2003, and I guarantee you, in looking through this, I was like, was I doing that? You know what I mean? And so I'm looking at, and obviously modern day servers, and I'm looking at that and I'm like, there's always something to be learned. And I think that's kind of the greater point here, where there's so much going on that you have to stay up with the stuff day to day. If not, you're going to miss something. The trends are cyclical, right? Rich, you see that, right? Like the trends, whether it's, user impersonation, privilege escalation, password sharing. I mean, these are tales as old as time, right? We're just finding better ways to prevent it.
The trends don't change, but the level of sophistication does. I mean, it's the same stuff that just keeps getting better and better from the bad guys, unfortunately, and more easily accessible to, those high quality hacking tools are not hard to get in their, there's businesses built around that. So, and they're good tools. So that's the challenge. And, it's easy to find and very sophisticated.
And increases the need to follow some best practices, which we'll be talking about today. Spot on MFA comes up in the majority of conversations, and this concept of security posture, like you brought up in your intro, I mean, security posture, cyber hygiene. I mean, these are the buzzwords that I've really seen being really hot in the market right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And you laid us right up into a little bit of a recap of last week's episode with some MITRE attack techniques with privilege escalation, unauthorized accounts, user impersonation. I mean, these are all things we're going to kind of get into a little bit today with user rights assignments, how properly configured assignments can better mitigate the risks of these. And I know we talked about this last week, but Ray, do you want to share just an actually 30 seconds to dive into any of these, talk about how user rights assignments really can mitigate some of this risk with the MITRE attack techniques?
Look, I'm going to be the first one to say I've made probably every mistake you can possibly make, right? Including assigning permissions to an individual user instead of a group and not using service accounts. I've done it all. I'm ashamed and not ashamed to admit it, because if you don't say it out loud, everybody else feels like it's just them. So you have to admit, you have to, like the SEALs say, right? You got to embrace the suck. So, I fully admit I've done some of this. And then the one good thing is I've always been a huge proponent of auditing. So there will be a time I'll never forget. We were doing a server audit for one of the clients. We do these regularly before we had automated tools that did this awesome stuff, right? I would say I wish I was an MSP today, because, oh, geez, if I had tools like Senteon, it'd make my life easier. But, he's not paying me to say that. But, I did this. We were doing an audit once for a law firm. And it was an all-female law firm. And don't worry, I'm not going to get canceled. It was an all-female law firm. And I'm going through the accounts, going through the old accounts. And there's one called Trash Can Bill. And I'm like, the reason I bring that up is because it's an all-female company. There are no men, and definitely no men named Bill. So apparently, before I got there, there was the company that handled the shredding and the document collection and disposal. And for God knows what reason, they needed access to AD. And so they didn't like him. So his name was Trash Can Bill. Nobody, till this day, nobody knows his full name. And Trash Can Bill had been replaced like 4 years prior to me starting as their MSP. And yeah, so, but he had a full login. And of course, he was absolutely a domain admin, because that's how everybody is. So yeah, nothing bad came out of it. Right. And I can only imagine what the password was. I didn't even want to ask. I just deactivate, check logs for use. But, and that's the thing. You do these audits and you always find so now when we find a rogue account, we call it a Trash Can Bill. And that's kind of stuck to this day.
Yeah, a couple of really key points there, auditing credentials and make sure those old accounts don't hang on is so key. And and also from an MSP's perspective, if you are taking on that law firm as a client, tools like Senteon and the CIS benchmarks and controls can really help you understand the risk that you're inheriting by taking on that client.
Yeah, and spot on. And Ray, you talk about making mistakes. This is really, brave of you to say almost. I think everyone in today's world wants to appear perfect. So one, kudos to you admitting it. That's how we do improve, like you said. But with something like user rights assignments, I have heard stories, hey, I don't want to go through each user. That creating an admin is going to create business disruption. They're not going to be able to perform their day-to-day job, and it's going to create all types of issues. So I guess I wanted you to talk a little bit more about making mistakes and how security can be disruptive. When you went through these user rights assignments, I imagine you've done it manually in the past. Did you create business disruption? How did you overcome it? Do you have to sell in this concept of assigning user rights to the end user? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, who was it? Benjamin Franklin said you can have security or convenience, but not both, right? And so, I look at it, and believe it or not, the stuff that's always bit me in the butt in the past has not been improper assignments, improper rights assignments in the beginning. I did it because there was a business need, and usually out of somebody's rush because it was something last minute, or we had to fix something. And so it got the job done. I've been fortunate enough where that didn't bite me in the ass until, I apologize, in the butt, until we went back and had to correct it. And we said, okay, no, now we're going to apply this baseline, this framework. We're going to do these, apply this policy framework. And then it was to unwind that spaghetti. That same law firm. I think they're not watching this. That same law firm. It was crazy when we started removing, domain admins, and it had all these security groups set up for just random. It was like each person had their own security group, and then there were additional security groups with like 2 people. So there was so much entanglement and overlapping that and they had I mean, I say this, and remember Trash Can Bill and this craziness going on. This was a multi-billion-dollar law firm. This was a big law firm. So inevitably, when I started undoing this stuff, and we planned for the best of it, we broke some stuff. We broke LOB apps. We broke single sign-on access to some of the web apps. It was a nightmare. And it got to the point where I actually had to go to the office manager and say, look, to do this properly, give me 48 hours of downtime, because it's either going to be downtime while you're working, or it's going to be prepared downtime, and let me do this without you guys, suffering the pain of it. They ultimately decided to do 48 hours of downtime, but you can do the math on a 250 person law firm that's, generating billions of dollars in annual revenue. 48 hours hurts. There's no version of that where it's a cheap proposition. And so even though there was no malicious actor, there was no nefarious action that happened that bit us, there was still absolutely downtime from the business's own decisions, and we needed to fix it. It wasn't an option to leave it in place.
Wow. And you were able to sell in that 48 hours of downtime. They understood the security risk. Let's put this in it. Go ahead.
Thankfully, there's enough. Rich and I were talking about the Fortinet vulnerabilities, right? The 0 day they were announcing yesterday, with the hundreds of thousands of affected units. And so it's easy enough to get that data to show to the client and show why it matters, right? The average cybersecurity incident costs at least $1 million in repair and aftermath. And this is back 2013, and there was still plenty of data to show. And all it took was taking that hourly number. So when they said, it's going to cost us X amount to be down 48 hours or 2 business days, I could throw that same number back and say, but if we don't do this and something goes awry, or somebody steals IP, or somebody shares client information because you have a disgruntled employee, because the threats can be inside as well as outside, your downtime is going to be much, much higher than 48 hours. I promise.
And your brand reputation, right?
Absolutely. You don't want to be that. I mean, responsible disclosure wasn't as big in 2013 as it is now. But absolutely, it would have had to do it to some people, at least the bar at minimum. So, yeah.
Oh, wait, hold on a second. I think Trash Can Bill just joined the live stream.
He's trying to log in right now.
I love it. And but as we wrap up this little MITRE attack technique overview, everything that we're talking about, you obviously have a background working with very large businesses. Over at Senteon, I work with businesses, as small as a one-man MSP shop. There are 100+ man MSP shops. They're out there, but they don't work with clients as large as what you're describing. Is this concept of setting least privilege access and user rights assignments, how important is it for the majority of MSPs out there? Is it important to every business of all size?
So based on the Forrester data, the average MSP, their clients are between 10 and 50 users. That's the average MSP I'm talking to also mimics that data perfectly. Yes, there's the outliers. There's the monster MSPs out there. And great, but these security postures have nothing to do with client size, right? Because we go to the client all the time when we're pitching MSP and we're talking security practices, and we tell them you don't need to be a certain size to get hit. You just need to have an IP address on the internet. That's all it takes. And it takes 2 weeks to scan all the IP addresses, depending on how you're doing it. And Shodan is a thing. So it's hard.
The prospecting list.
The prospecting list. Oh, I love looking for email servers without SPF records. No, but the prospect list is there. And the point is, anybody can get hit. And let's go to that, the enterprises, right? The 1,000-person plus enterprise, they have the funds, and almost always they have a little reserve balance for these things if they happen, right? They have their rainy day funds specifically for cybersecurity events, or specifically for other events. The average SMB doesn't have that. They're going paycheck to paycheck or month to month. So if they have to get shut down for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, that's misery. Now, the positive side to that is the URAs that we talk about, or these settings that we talk about in the CIS benchmarks and all that, those are universal. It doesn't matter the client size. So if you figure out how to make a process out of it, problem solved. It should not be this client needs more security than this client. That car doesn't exist where this car on the road needs a seatbelt and that car on the road doesn't. So, why play with security like that?
If you have a security process made, it shouldn't vary client to client. I think that's the direction I've been hearing MSPs talk to me about, especially doing these benchmarks, which I'll let Rich introduce that a little bit more. But I went into these conversations with MSPs expecting, hey, I want to meet the bare minimum of the benchmarks. I just want to do a baseline, something just to say I'm doing it. But what it's turned into is these MSPs that reach out to me, they want to meet every single benchmark. They don't want to do partial. So I do see a very strong trend in the positive direction. So love hearing you echo all those thoughts.
You'd never see somebody buy an umbrella that only had 3 panels, because that's all the coverage they need, right? The other 3, oh well. Or you go to the dentist, you never see a dentist tell one person you need to brush your teeth twice a day, and the other person you need to brush your teeth once a day. That's never happened in the history of ever. So why are our professional, business class, enterprise grade, security first MSPs doing anything but exactly that? Set the standard for everybody. When I was an MSP, I went after regulated businesses, whether it's FINRA, FERPA, SOX, FDA, whatever, because I knew they all had very similar requirements. It was the same, and it wasn't me saying it. It was some government entity saying you need to do these things. And separate from CMMC, DoD, a little more complicated, but like for the majority of these regulated industries, the rules are the same. So it doesn't matter. Like, you apply this stuff and it works. So treat all your clients like that. And if I had a non-regulated client, I still treated them like that, because why make the distinction?
You already have your process. Why would you create a second process for less secure? I mean,
Awesome leading, guys. Let's get into it.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show some of these CIS benchmarks. But Rich, while I'm doing that, do you mind just introducing again what the CIS benchmarks are and why they're important?
Yeah, absolutely. I jumped in there because of all the regulatory discussions. And what's really great about the CIS benchmarks is they are recognized as a secure configuration in most of those frameworks that Ray just rattled off. So using our configurations helps you achieve that compliance if you do have a customer or you're operating in a regulated industry yourself. So, which is awesome. So essentially what the CIS benchmarks offer is a comprehensive guide for configuring user rights assignments. It's a best practice guideline that takes the guesswork out of setting those configurations. Senteon can automate that for you, which is awesome. And it's kind of the easy button. You don't have to do a lot of research. The research has been done. They've been tested against the MITRE ATT&CK framework by all kinds of people in our community consensus process, and you should use them if you're not now.
Yeah, and as I'm showing here, CIS also provides the description, the rationale, and impact. A little bit more technical of a dive, for your engineers to read through, understand what they all mean. And the purpose of this webinar that we're hosting is to try to bring these documents a little bit more of a story to them, which is why we're so lucky to have guests like Ray on the show, Ken last week, and so on. So these settings are all supported, free downloads through CIS directly, through Senteon, however you want to get your information. But these details and what CIS is doing is absolutely incredible. So with that, let's hop into some of these settings. Looks like, let me get my screen back to normal. All right, so kicking off, enable computer and user accounts to be trusted for delegation is set to workstations with no one and DC servers to administrators. So just like last week, we're gonna see a lot of no ones, a lot of administrators. I mean, this is gonna come out a lot through the URA presentation today, but Ray, can you talk to us about credential delegation and why no one should have access?
This is one of those scary ones, because the way it works, when it's delegated to another machine, the other machine is not taking a token. They're having the actual credentials of the previous machine, and so they're acting as the previous machine. What makes this so deadly is this can cascade down. So it's, besides the obvious effects of having a device that has access that it shouldn't have access to, right? Like, Zach goes and logs into Rich's machine and now he has, all this awesome power. The problem is, because it's doing it as the other person or as the other device, it screws with the logs, and it goes and it makes the forensic side of it much more difficult when you're going through logs trying to determine who did what, because it all looks like Rich, even though Zach was the one, going and downloading, go-karts or, go-kart music for Tokyo Drift. I don't know. I'm just making shit up, but you get what I'm saying though. You know what I mean? And so it's one of those things, like, that's why I find these so scary. It's not so much, all these things can, if applied inappropriately, absolutely can put you in a bad position. But, it's the left of boom, right of boom problem. At right of boom, you definitely want to be able to isolate where it came from so you can start, correcting the problems. And this one is one of those where it makes it really difficult to find. Not impossible, but you're going to have a lot of work to do. So, this is one of those things where there's very few use cases where it actually needs to be turned on. And even the Microsoft security docs, point out these are the vulnerabilities with enabling this. Don't do it. So, set to none. Absolutely. Please. I would even argue, domain admins don't need it. Yes, you do. You need it for, some of the MSC stuff. But, but even then, and that's one of the reasons also you're enabling security profiles or security rules for this. So now the domain admins have this awesome power, which is why domain admins should not be logging in as the domain admin when they log in the server. You log in as a user account unless you need the elevated credentials. Because you're not going to notice if somebody else's, some other device is using the credentials. And there's no setting for, as far as I know, there's no setting for how long it retains the delegated credentials either. So it's on until that cache gets flushed.
Yep, and I love that you brought up auditing. So next week we'll actually have Eric Woodard on the show from ProTech, and if you have the wrong users, just like you're talking about, if you're signed in as someone else, how is that going to affect the audit trail? I mean, how are you supposed to do that forensics investigation? Are you going to yell at Rich when it was a misconfigured setting by admin? Or are you going to find out who the hell logged on to Rich's account? I mean, how do you figure that out? I don't know if there's an easy answer to that.
We know you're out there, Zach. We know you're out there. So
we're blaming Zach. It's either Zach or Trash Can Bill. It's one of the two for sure.
Fairly obvious. Yeah.
Awesome.
So let's talk about the impact of a remote system shutting down a server. It's kind of a similar type of thing.
Yeah. I mean, this is impact the remote workforce too. Is this a setting that matters to that?
I mean, to me, it does. So looking at this, part of the problem is, if you have the ability to remotely, imagine your remote users have this functionality. They're logged into a TS server, or they're logged in through RDG, and they have the ability to log, or they're doing a, one-to-one or something like that, and they have the ability to shut down. If they're shutting down on a TS farm, they're shutting down servers. You have the ability to shut down services, which you shouldn't. Which you should never have the ability to do. Now, say you shut down important services that are doing your IAM stuff or whatever it happens to be. Now you're putting yourself in a position where you could, depending on the settings that are in place, you may be able to escalate your privilege because those safeguards are now not functioning. At minimum, you can create your own little mini DDoS, which is not great. So, these are not things you want to get done or you want to have open to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of slides today. I think I forgot to mention before we got into this, we have about 20 more settings we're going to cover. So we are going to be zooming a little fast to make sure there's time for Q&A. But this next setting, right in scope with what we were just talking about, generate security audits is set to local service and network service. So Ray, in that did you know section, we do have IIS application pools require access to this policy to ensure proper functioning of IIS. Do you mind introducing what IIS is and why this is an important setting?
I mean, it's all our favorite, anybody running Screen Connect knows, or Control. No, wait, now it's Screen Connect again. Anybody knows. No, IIS, Internet Information Server. This is Windows server's version of web server. If you're in Linux world, you're doing Nginx or Apache or any of the million other variants. So you can do that as on Windows too. But IIS is the Windows server for web. It is not just web. It also handles SMTP. It also handles a bunch of other functions, has its own certificate store besides the Windows certificate store. So it has a lot of functions that even if you're not hosting any websites on your internet, there's a lot of use cases where it still needs to be running. The problem is Microsoft Hey, Drew. Microsoft, yeah, just remove IIS and then RM/dash F, asterisk, and you're good to go. So, but the problem with this is Microsoft is amazing at providing all of these tools at your disposal and not enabling any of them by default. So, this is with M365 and Azure just as much as it is with on-premise AD, on-premises AD. So with these servers, all the logging you need to go do that IR is turned off by default. So you absolutely need this turned on.
Just as a reference point from a CIS perspective, all of those products that you just described generally meet about 30% of the CIS benchmark recommendations out of the box. So it's
30%. I thought it was even less than that.
I'm being generous. It depends on the product.
I mean, if you're a glass half full guy, no, there's no way to look at it that it's positive.
That glass ain't full either way.
Not even close. Yeah.
No, they want to make it really easy for anything to run uninterrupted, but it unfortunately does leave a lot of security gaps.
Mm-hmm. And this next setting, ensure impersonate a client after authentication. It has a few different ops tiers, whether it's a workstation or server, but something interesting I see here is the recommendation may change when the web server IIS role is installed. So could you kind of talk about why, I guess a little bit of CIS, the recommendations can change depending on what's set up in this environment. Could you just kind of talk about why this makes things complicated? Because I hear from a lot of MSPs, hey, implementing these benchmarks are super hard. I mean, recommendations are literally changing depending what's on the environment. So could you take a couple minutes and just talk about the challenges MSPs might run into and then a little bit on this setting?
Oh. I'm sorry, that was for me or Rich?
Yeah, you Ray.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. No, absolutely. So this is one of those that 90% of the time it doesn't have an impact on day-to-day functions. So it's not going to hurt you. Whatchamacallit. But but at the same time, you risk. So the risk that happens here is user logs in, you impersonate that user after the fact, you use that impersonated user, maybe create a service or leave something, and that becomes your entry point for other malicious actions to take place, which we can all agree is terror bad, or as Phil likes to say, big bad. So that kind of stuff. Rich, this stuff more than me. Is this in line with how CIS sees it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you're essentially enabling a backdoor, and that's never a good idea.
Yeah, it's the escalation privilege risks to this. I mean, Yep. So perfect. So looking at that next setting, increase scheduling priority is set to admins Windows Manager. Talk to us a little bit about this. I know administrative tools do not require this right to increase scheduling priority. So I guess, what does this setting mean? Why is it important to set? Right.
Oh, sorry.
It's the ratio, man.
It's the ratio. I'm telling you, it has me off. No, this is one of those where we're all aware of application dependencies, right? Like anybody who's run QuickBooks on a Windows AD server, one, bad on you. Second, the Windows QuickBooks server service will take over DNS, and suddenly you have no DNS host on your network. That's always fun. Again, stop installing production stuff on AD servers. But some of us named Ray may have done this at one point in the past. But the problem is when you do stuff like that, and if the setting's not set, you can start reordering the services. Or say you have a service that's going to introduce a hook. Sorry, webhook. I'm web brain today. But introduce a hook into a dependency or DLL or some other service, and maybe start information grabbing or side loading other data, and it becomes extremely dangerous. That's one of those things. One of the things I used to do as an MSP. First thing I do is go into the servers, and I would audit which services are running. And I start, going back through the dependency trees and going back through the folders, and for some of the stuff, not all, checking hashes and just to make sure they are what they say they are. and looking through logs for any crazy access that they may have attempted. It's tedious, but when you're walking into a new environment that was set up by somebody else, I don't know any other way to be 100% certain what you have, because services were almost always the last thing I looked at when something was running and being a pain in the butt. You know what I mean? So I try to hit that action early and upfront.
And how often are you actually reviewing the user rights privileges? Is this something that's, reviewing every quarter, annually, or ad hoc when needed?
So nowadays, or at the exit of my MSP, and even with our internal operations now, I'm more a fan of desired state configuration across all the places. So it's more keeping things in line with the desired configuration than it is looking for the outliers. So that is all done programmatically today, and we keep it that way. One of the hardest things to do was be to stop doing it manually. We had to stop creating accounts manually. We had to stop creating groups manually. We did it always programmatically because that gave us the list of things being done. We were certain it was being done the exact same way every time. And so then the RMM would go ahead, and we changed a couple RMMs over the years, and eventually just PowerShelled it. But over the years, because let's be honest,
The best script engine, right?
it works, and it works in Linux. It's wonderful. So to make sure everything was in alignment, and if something was an outlier for some reason, that was an easy red flag, because it would tell us A, something was done outside of our process. It was probably done non-programmatically. B, we got to figure out how the heck that happened, right? Like how the heck, because ideally nothing should be happening outside the outside of our automation means.
Let's we got to move because we got a lot of slides. I'm sorry, Ray. Let's talk about another entry point, which is actually, I was looking at the device drivers. Thank you. So this is another potential entry point for malicious software to enter your environment. Ray, what's your thoughts on device drivers?
This is one of the easier ones. If it's a printer driver, it doesn't work. No, I'm kidding. Especially if it's a Windows printer driver. No, this is one of the easier ones because you talk to 100% of MSPs and ask them, do you let your users install their own software? And unanimously, they all say no. Why would you ever do that? Absolutely not. It's crazy. This is the same thing, but for drivers. And drivers operate with high privilege. So when they're operating with high privilege, they can do all the nefarious stuff. You don't need to install applications. If you can create a service and load and unload services. Now you can, you can give yourself elevated access to do all sorts of bad stuff. And it becomes more difficult to track down because it's the service doing this. So now you're trying to track down what service spawned these actions, who created that service. You know what I mean? It becomes this quagmire. IR is not fun. My hat's off to all the IR firms out there. It's black voodoo to me. Like, it is scary stuff. I respect the hell out of it. I'm glad I'm not doing that. I'll stick to my BGP and my yelling at people for MFA.
I have a feeling I have a little bit of an IR question if you can shed some light. So you were in the last slide and this one, you were talking about the red flags when that configuration isn't what it says, or in this case, if a new driver is loading or anything. Once you have that alert or something is happening, what steps can an MSP that maybe isn't fluent in IR or anything, like how do you figure out why that alert happened or where it came from? An alert is only as valuable as their remediation, right?
So this is one of those areas that I'm very proud to say, not it. This is no, seriously. So, I look at it and I'll do the design, I'll do the recommendations, the actual implementation and the other stuff, the operation of it, and afterward the auditing when it needs to be. I leave that to more experienced professionals, right? We have in-house security engineers and we rely on third parties as well. Because IR again is its own science. So when something like this would happen, we're looking at when the service was installed. We're looking at, if what logs that service hopefully has generated, if at all. We're looking for signatures where any files that were modified by that driver or whatever it happens to be. And the idea is to understand scope and impact. Nothing I'm saying is remediation yet. We just want to know how bad it is.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in don't fix what you don't know is broken yet, right? Like, it's very easy to say shut it down. It's very easy to say wipe the server, and that's the fastest way to get your insurance company to yell at you. So we do very preliminary or very surface level review of what's going on. If it's something that we're absolutely certain we know the scope of it and it's not a severe thing, we will try to remediate. Now, if there's any inclination that it might be a breach, or it might be a data leak, or it might be something other more severe, at that point we have our IR plan. We're hands off.
Sure.
We're making the phone calls to the appropriate agencies. Because if we're telling clients trust us because we're the knowledgeable ones, we're in the right place, we need to be smart enough to do the same thing when something bad happens.
No,
Yeah, you have to know what you're good at too. I mean, Ray, you're good at many things, but you just told us IR is not your thing. You have to kind of stay in your lane, right? You got to know what you're good at.
Absolutely.
And get help when you need it.
Well, that's why smart people, like if I started doing IR, Chris Lair would yell at me. I mean, he yells at everybody, but he would yell at me too. You know what I mean?
I gotta reach out to Chris to get on this show too. I'd love to hear his input.
He's the best. Tell him I said he's going to yell at people. He absolutely will. So
I've heard people joke about him in the cyber call. So I also did market research with him years ago.
But that's the catch, though. Have this stuff in advance. Have those contacts in advance. Have the relationships. We've talked 1,000 times about, the FBI will help you investigate cyber incidents. Have those contacts already. Reach out. Hey, if something happened, who would I talk to? Just introducing myself. So you have that in your Rolodex or your, calendar, your Google, whatever.
Great idea.
Because when it goes south, it goes south fast.
You don't want to be hunting and pecking at that point.
All right, this next setting, ensure lock pages in memory is set to no one. So I actually got a quick story on this one. I want to make sure it's very well understood that when applications are installed onto these workstations, servers, it is possible that these applications are changing local group policy without you being aware. So configuration drift, I'll bring this up every single week. Just because you have it set to a certain state does not mean it actually is that state. So here's an example of where we were actually onboarding Senteon, and one of our features is we show what the pre-configured settings are upon installing Senteon. And we actually were able to identify a certain application that had locked pages in memory, a music platform or some sort of video editing, something. They wanted to make sure they could have all the resources they needed to perform no matter what. So Ray, there's my story, but talk to us a little bit of your point of view with this setting here.
This is one of those things where like you don't notice it until something breaks. And then it becomes crazy the number of applications that start to require these permissions that maybe they don't actually need, but they're using them. The problem with this is again, it's very easy to to DDoS yourself because you can oversubscribe to the memory being used and you're pushing out much more important processes. If anything, Windows is very, very good at understanding which processes maintain priority. But like you said, some applications can go ahead and change that around. And when that happens, and who doesn't want to be top of the heap, right? Who doesn't want all of your 4 gigs of RAM if you're Dustin Bolander, but like, but like,
a lot of shout outs this week.
Oh yeah. I love my friends, but I'm just giving you future guests, man. But what happens is, they make these changes and suddenly you have contention for that same RAM space, or you have much more needed higher processes for the OS that aren't operating, maybe like your NLA or maybe like your authentication or maybe, some of the other important stuff, and it doesn't work. And suddenly you have a bunch of blue screens, and we all know blue screens is a first step to getting access to all the stuff you shouldn't have access to, right?
Yeah, let's move on again. So, Henry, why don't you advance us? And I think we got one more, right? Did we already do that one? There we go. That one. So, Ray, let's talk about using Logon as a batch job. And how do we mitigate risk around here? And what are the exposures?
And what is a batch job for the non-technical audience too, Ray?
So This is one of those things. It's we're all familiar with bat files, right? You have it in there, which is a batch file. It's very high level. I hate to even call it scripting language because you can play around with a bunch of stuff. It's not overly complicated by any means. It's not PowerShell, but Snover doesn't even call PowerShell language anyway. But anyway, separate from that, the problem with batch jobs. I'm sorry, a little frazzled today. The problem with batch jobs is you have this. It's a list of functions that are going to execute based on whatever triggers, right? It could be time, could be set to based on another trigger or something like that. The problem is I'm seeing a recurring theme here. This is another one that allows you to do things on behalf of somebody else, right? It's very easy to create another service and then start acting as that service. That's the real danger, right? Because what's better than making a new account trash can bill 2 when you can just be trash can bill, when you can just do stuff as them. So what happens with this is there are legitimate reasons to have batch jobs set up. There's maintenance, there's audit processes, even the drifting, right? You want to check for a drift in alignment. There's absolute reasons to have this in place. I can't think of any that have anything to do with an end user doing this stuff, right? Because you have a lot of danger. And these batch processes or these batch jobs, again, run in a higher privilege space. When they're in a higher privilege space, they can do all sorts of nasty stuff. So if we're telling don't always do stuff as the domain admin, we're not just saying that to the MSPs, we're saying it to the computer as well. The problem is the computer, you need to tell it, or the server, you need to have these settings in place so it doesn't do that stuff. Otherwise, just like a toddler, it'll do whatever you let it do. Or just like an adult me, it'll do whatever you let it do,
Henry, let's move forward again. We've
Windows sets up the machines. I mean, they're set up that way by default to allow you to do everything. So
yep.
It's just encouraged across the board. So that's why these settings are so important to configure. Mm-hmm. And this next one with configure logon as a service, this is actually our first setting of our webinar series that is actually an L2. Rich, do you mind introducing what the levels mean within the CIS benchmarks?
Sure, Zach, thank you. So the CIS benchmarks have different profiles, we call them. We generally are introducing level 1 profile concepts, and they're recommended for all systems. When Zach is talking about level 2 or L2 profile, that is a more advanced and a more cybersecurity forward group of settings. But once you get into L2, you may start introducing issues with your existing workload. So, we absolutely do all of level 1, and we want you to get through level 2 as much as possible as well. And this is an L2 setting. Thanks, Zach.
Absolutely. Yep. So the levels are definitely important to help MSPs with that prioritization. Ray, do you mind talking to us a little bit about configure logon as a service?
I don't see the problem. You just set everybody to log on as a service. Nothing could go wrong. I hate beating a dead horse, but services operate on a different security level than end users. You're giving it access to a space they shouldn't have access to. And these are things, and they're not immediately visible, right? So if, again, Zach goes and walks over to Rich's workstation, you're going to see Rich there. If Zach logs in remote into Rich's workstation, you're going to see the workstation get taken over. If a service runs, it's running in the background. You don't know what's going on. It can consume resources. It can assign resources. It can create users. It can create other service accounts. It can spawn new processes. These are all very dangerous things. Now, pair that with, you have the delegation. If that's not set properly, you have all these other means. Because Rich, back me up here. Usually when there's a breach, it's not because of one opening. It's they use some openings to get to the next opening, to the next opening, to the next opening. And
86
that's where the real
days on average, people are in and having their way before it's recognized. 86 days. So it's a lot of time to build a lot of services and move a lot of data.
It's a whole season. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this next setting, and looks like we do have about 15 minutes left. So start hitting a little bit more rapid fire on your Ray so we can get through.
Got it.
But manage auditing and security log. This again is going back to audits, logs, and everything with IR. Could you just kind of talk about why this is important to set up as well?
This brings up the dangerous clear key. That's the extent of this. You don't want anybody but the administrators to be able to go and mess with the logs, either what's logs are enabled, or being able to clear out the logs or change any of the log settings. Those need to be tightly controlled, otherwise you're in for a bad day. And to the flip side of that, the only people that care about messing with the logs are the bad people. So you definitely don't
that's
want
what
to
I was
give
going
them
to
access to
say. So you're telling me the bad people don't want to be found? They just want to sit in there for as long as they can?
at least 86 days for sure.
No, spot on. Love that answer. So we were talking about earlier with modifying, and the next two settings have to do with modifying object layer. And then we're going to get to the next one, similar vein. But why should no one be modifying an object label?
So this has to do with the integrity of the file, right? Or the process or whatever happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
They have their labels so the system knows what's what. It's in the layperson view, it's changing the you can call it like changing the file extension of a file, right? You change. That's one of the most common things. You ever get those fish emails that open this something.pdf.exe? Oh, this is very similar, but on the service level or on the object level, you can trick Windows into thinking it's okay to open or okay to run. And Windows is very smart at saying, I'm going to let Rich do stuff, but not Zach. But if Rich changes his name to Zach, we're all messed up. You know what I mean? So this setting prevents that.
Let's go a little deeper on that vein. What about firmware? How dangerous is that?
Firmware is absolutely safe. I mean, something that rewrites how a service or a device, or I'm sorry, how a device or peripheral operates, whether it's scraping the data and saving in memory and then spitting it out to a third-party actor, spitting it back to the system. Firmware is dangerous. That's when I said I check the hashes on stuff. Firmware is always item number one on those things, because that's the easiest place, because we update firmware. We're taught to update firmware. We have to update firmware. Make sure you're updating the right firmware, and it's firmware from a known source, because they're very, very dangerous.
It's pretty easy to click the wrong download if you're just Googling, hey, Microsoft Pro upgrade or anything else of that vein. I mean, there's plenty of phishing links out there for us to get confused by.
Yeah, they know you're looking for it. Absolutely.
So perform volume maintenance tasks set to administrators. I can't necessarily think of a reason a bad actor would want to take advantage of this, but for best cyber hygiene practices, I imagine it's pretty valuable.
I mean, you don't want any hard drive or any data store operations being handled by the end user, just as a general, baseline. You don't want them deleting. You don't want them deleting volumes. You don't want them extending or shrinking volumes because they don't know what they're doing. You don't want them marking volumes for archival. You just don't want them touching the volumes, period. Yeah, I don't see a single use case for anybody but an admin. And even then, I would limit it to specific admin tasks, to an admin role, not to all admins.
Lines up well for our next slide again. You're a good front man.
Doing my best.
Yeah, I think this is very, just builds upon that even, right?
Oh, absolutely. And if you notice, yes, it's all about user rights assignments, but I hope the people watching this realize there's so many different things that intertangle with each other that one lets the other, gives the opening for the next one. Profiles running in a single process is the same thing. This is one of those ones that you don't think about until something happens. You're like, oh yeah, that was a thing. The reason this is important is because I go look at your computer and I'm looking at, say I'm the nefarious actor, I'm within that, 86 days, right? I'm looking at your services running, your processes running, and I'm seeing what's going on. And then I'm saying, okay, well, this person has AV from XYZ company, and I know the countermeasures are this. And you can start to work around that stuff. You're giving too much information, right? It's like the old thing, most Apache admins, turn off that it tells you what version of Apache you're running in the headers and stuff like that, or in the server responses. It's no different here. You don't want to give out information unless it's absolutely necessary, because you're giving them intel to work against you.
Every large software company's business model. The more data, the better.
Oh,
it
yeah.
applies for the bad actors, man. The more they know, the easier it is for them to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So love that. Looking at this next setting, profile system performance is another one set to admins. Let's talk more about this.
Yeah, it's This is one of those weird ones. You ever see the articles where like they can tell how you move your mouse, where you click, how quickly you click. Like some of the advertisers can identify the person behind the mouse and the keyboard, right? This is one of those things where giving out information is very, very dangerous. So based on the application performance, we were talking about priority service and process priority previously. If you look at it, you're looking at thumbprints and you're saying, well, this one's more important. This is more important for the system. I should attack that first. And so, you want to be, it's no different than on an iPhone, that it changes the MAC around when it registers to a new AP. This is the same thing. You want to limit how much data you're giving anybody potentially in your system. You're not operating only when the person is in your system. You're operating beforehand so that if they did get access, you're not giving them much to work with.
I think this next setting's kind of interesting. We talked about IIS a little bit already, and this is a setting that IIS needs, but it also presents some opportunities for the bad guys. What do you think, Ray?
Well, it's back to those impersonation things, right? That's the problem. It's that, this is delegation, but for processes, the tokens, the authentication for the process. And now you're saying one process can replace another process and take their token and start using it as that. So, Rich logs in and says, I'm me and I'm doing this. And Zach comes in and says, yes, I am Rich and I am doing this, but we're going to go to this website instead. And suddenly, you're in a paste bin and you're downloading some really bad PowerShell.
No, spot on. And Ray, we're almost done with these settings. I promise. There's about 4 more, so we'll get through these. We have a little bit of Q&A, and we'll be wrapping up. So thanks for bearing with us on one of the longer topics. So
I'm trying to be succinct, so I'm doing my best.
You're doing great. Thanks for all the stories along the way, and definitely keep them up. So this one with restore files and directories set to admins. I mean, I can't think of a use case a user should be doing backups on their own machines. I mean, the accidental loss and corruption possible.
So this is one of those that I can see use cases for end users, but there's workarounds for it already. Most of the backup companies in their tools already have conventions for users to say, please let me restore this. And that way the MSP can take it on. Notice I'm saying there's a request, not an action. Well, here it's the same thing. We're looking at, we're making sure only the administrators can do these functions, because while you may have deleted something or something may have been upgraded, right? Say that firmware, if this is in place, anybody could take that older firmware, reapply it with those known vulnerabilities or whatever it is, and again, get access to the system so you can, do that, do extra actions, do extra bad stuff.
Let's talk about another shutdown scenario on the next slide, Ray. So we've got a couple of groups here that we're allowing permissions for, which seems to make sense. Can you describe?
I mean, so this is one of those that I'll say, even from outside of security, this was a pain in the butt setting that I made sure was always set, because you want to make sure that the appropriate users are able to, in any case, do the appropriate actions on the server, right? So, being able to shut down the server, being able to sign in, that's awesome. That's great. But again, you don't want a domain controller shut down, right? This goes hand in hand with one of the previous slides. You don't want the domain controller to be shut down. You don't want your DNS, DHCP, whatever roles are on different servers, or your TS server. You don't want those shut down. Could you imagine, you gain access remotely to a system, you create your own channel, and then you shut down remote access for everybody else, by TS server because you're in already, you opened a port on their firewall. Like, how bad is that? I mean, your hands are literally tied behind your back. And then keep in mind now, so many businesses are remote. That server's in a data center somewhere. That server's in an office that very few people are in. The MSP is definitely not sitting inside that office. So
it's in Hong Kong somewhere, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So your time to get to it, to start fixing it, is going to be exacerbated by those things. So you want to be very, very careful.
And one of my favorite things about the series, we do have live questions coming in, Ray, and this one comes this one comes from Stanford. Henry, if you don't mind pulling that up. We got a couple more settings to get through, but this is a student from GSU. So
nice.
Yeah. So I want to talk about let's see. First, that sounds like a multi-part, right, Henry? So
Yeah.
it says, what I want to know is what should I already know at this point? So it looks like he's still a student, final year as a CIS student at GSU. Okay, what's that second part? Or is that the full first question, Henry? Yeah. I guess focusing on these benchmarks, Ray, how much would you expect an entry-level cybersecurity graduate to know about the benchmarks and these granular details?
All of it. No.
Every
Okay.
450 settings.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and so the reason I say that is there's ample resources out there, right? I can't say one security policy is more important than another security policy, because as we've seen, they leverage each other to get access to systems. There's nothing wrong with saying, I'm going to study all of this before I start doing it in practice. Now, realistically, what a lot happens is you're not going to know all this stuff. Nobody's going to know all this stuff. You have to leverage proper tools like Senteon. You have to leverage these tools, and you have to leverage, and you're going to have it create real life work experience. That's going to be the things that are going to cement these things in memory, right? Nobody remembers how to, bring back a public file storage, or, how to, if I had to reload ISA 2003 or whatever, that's not stuff that's going to be burnt into your brain until you've done it a couple times. So do the book reading, understand what they are, do the deep dive research. The Microsoft docs are actually really good about this stuff, telling you what could happen and how to prevent it. And then once you have an understanding of top level what they mean, then you can go to start working and start applying these things. And that experience is really what's going to cement it in your knowledge. You don't know it until you've done it. That's just how I feel about most anything.
Yeah, I had to step away for a second, but I'd like to add that study the CIS controls. I mean, it's an awesome framework that that you can really learn a lot from. And if you're if you're trying to move into that first position or whatever, demonstrating and having that knowledge will really take you far.
Yeah, and to summarize that last couple points in his questions, I'm going to wrap it up into one part 2 and part 3 into one part. He goes a little bit further to say, hey, are there certifications he should be looking at trying to get before getting his first job? And what type of role should that first job be in? Is that help desk? Any input on that, Ray?
So I'm a big fan of, if you're entering the MSP, well, I'm a big fan of internships to begin with, and apprenticeships. We run our own. I've run mine. I'm a product of internships. I got into this space because I had a big brother and big brothers, big sisters, and he took me out doing these jobs, and that was my first foray into computers. So I'm a big fan of that. I also I have the highest respect for the technicians that enter early in your career, work the help desk. You need that visibility. You need that customer interaction. You need that. And when you get higher in your levels in your career, you're going to be very specialized in a single thing. So you're not going to get that wide exposure. That help desk gets you that exposure. Work the help desk first. Handle those printer tickets. Handle those password reset tickets. They're going to bore you to death. You should not be there more than 2 years. All right. Don't work help desk more than 2 years. But that should be your launch point into other spaces. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be the guy or girl that knows how to apply the settings, but not how it actually affects the end users. You need
always
that
keep learning. First. You got to always keep learning, throughout your career is really key.
And thank you for joining the webinar series. So last 2 settings for you, Ray. Let's power through these and we'll hopefully end right at the hour mark. So ensure synchronized directory services data is set to no one. And this, as a note, this is for domain controllers only. This isn't on MS or workstations. This is a unique setting.
This is a real simple one. I'll sum it up quickly. You don't want to give data to people that shouldn't have it, or to services or devices that shouldn't have it. Your directory services have all the data. That's all the authentication, all the security. You do not want to give that access, that plethora of information, to anybody that doesn't absolutely need it. So lock it down.
Last one's really extremely dangerous too, or the next one. I'm not sure if it's the last.
It is.
Very dangerous.
Very dangerous. I mean, this is just Rich keeps his password.txt file on his desktop like we all do. I'm kidding.
All of us.
But all of us. But that, if it's in his user profile, that should be locked into, system and him only. And suddenly, Zach comes in because he's been messing with Rich all day, and he takes ownership of the file. And, we're joking with password.txt, but there's plenty of files or services that are running or DLLs or firmware. There's plenty of objects you can take ownership of that are extremely dangerous. So you want everybody operating in their own space, and you don't want them to be able to break outside those walls.
Awesome. Well, thanks for powering through all those settings with us, Ray. I actually have one question for myself. I have a few listed on the slide that Henry's pulling up. We talked about remote workers today. We did talk about the impact of not setting this up right, but one to bring Dustin on the show. But what does this help out with compliance? Cyber insurance is a hot topic. I mean, does user rights have anything to do with this? Because I will say, from what I've seen in the MSP market, this is a complex process that's not often done.
So I'll use CIS Benchmarks as a perfect example of this. It's the last thing whenever I get something from my engineers and they propose something to do moving forward. My question is, where did this come from? Where did this best practice? Who validated it? Right. So if you're using something like CIS Benchmarks, this is not you came up with it off the top of your head. This is something that is already agreed to by a good set of professionals in the industry and others that are practicing it in their own businesses. It's tried and tested. Your plans that are not tried and tested are not plans. Those are F around and find out, right? So stick to a framework. CIS Benchmarks is a perfect starting point. And should something happen, it is very easy to say to your insurance provider, whoever it is, we were doing what we're supposed to be doing. We were doing the prescribed actions. We made every attempt to do this stuff. And
so critical.
Let's be honest, stuff everybody gets it at some point. So you want to prove that you did the work. And that will help you with your insurance policy and the payouts and everything else.
And if you have to go to court for any reason, I know Roddy in episode 2, he kept talking about having that proof is critical, showing that you're doing it. If that end client doesn't want to do something, force them to sign off on who said, hey, I'm accepting this risk. That documentation, that paper trail, just like the audit logs and event logs we talked about today, it's all critical, that name associated with the trail.
And it should be noted before we close out, none of this is one and done. You have to monitor for drift. You have to audit to make sure things are in alignment with what you're trying to do. Whether you're using an awesome tool to do it like Senteon, or you're using, pen and paper, whatever you do, don't do the pen and paper. I did that. It's so bad. You know what I mean? Again, Zach, where the hell were you 10 years ago?
We were a little late, but we're coming up now.
Yeah. For the new kids.
We were working in socks, some of our founding members.
But, that's the point. But this is stuff that has to be checked regularly. And that's why you want to automate as much as humanly possible.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Ray. So just as a couple concluding slides, we do this show every Wednesday at 1 p.m. So we got Eric Woodard coming on next week to talk about accounts and audit policies in the benchmarks. Then we're going to Sean Higgins with device and domain member. And we actually have Wes Spencer coming on to talk about interactive login. He's going to give a different perspective, given he maybe hasn't directly implemented these himself, but he's very much has a lot of thoughts. So
and we also have a surprise CIS guest on one of these episodes, but it's going to be probably a last minute announcement.
We'll do some build up for it. So
the tension, it's palpable. I love it.
Drama.
Awesome. We also have our newsletter series. So we will be doing a recap of today's episode with some exclusive deep dive slides. We provide these slides for subscribing to the newsletter so that you can help increase the awareness, sell these settings into your clients, or prove upstream how important they are. So feel free to subscribe. We'll drop the links in the comments. And the last one, Rich and I are always happy to connect. Ray, I should have put your slide up here. I keep telling myself I need to redo the format here so I can get everyone's picture.
It's all good. You don't need my picture. It's all right.
If you do want to join the show, feel free to reach out to me directly. Would love to have more guests. And if you are looking to implement those CIS benchmarks, Senteon does help out with that, as well as going through CIS directly. So thank you all for joining, and I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, everybody.